The morning my mother called to tell me Grandma needed help with her birthday party, I was already in my car with a coffee going cold in the cup holder, running 15 minutes late for parent-teacher conferences. I almost let it go to voicemail. I almost didn't pick up. Looking back now, I'm glad I did not, because of anything my mother said, but because of everything she didn't. "We're throwing Grandma an 80th, she told me. "The whole family's coming in. I need you to come up Friday and help set things up." I said yes before she even finished the sentence. That was always my problem with my family. I said yes the way other people breathe automatically, without thinking, because stopping felt more dangerous than just going along. My name is Claire. I'm 29 years old. I teach 4th grade at an elementary school in Columbus, Ohio, and I have spent the better part of my adult life being the person my family calls when they need something handled quietly and without complaint. I am the youngest of 3. My brother Daniel is 34 and works in finance in New York. My sister Melissa is 31 and lives 40 minutes from my parents in the same suburb where we grew up. I drove 3.5 hours from Columbus to be there. Neither of them offered to come early. What I didn't know on that Friday when I pulled into my grandmother's driveway, the long gravel one, lined with old oak trees that she has never once let anyone cut down, was that my mother had already made plans to take my father and both of my siblings to a resort in Asheville for the long weekend, a full 5 days. Spa treatments, golf, a private dinner on the Saturday night. She had booked it 2 months earlier. She had not mentioned a single word of it to me. I found out the way I found out most things in my family by accident, too late to do anything about it. I walked through the front door with 2 bags of groceries and a folding table I'd borrowed from a neighbor, and my grandmother was sitting in the living room in her good cardigan, the pale blue one she only wore for company, watching the driveway through the window. Her face when she saw me was the kind of face that made my chest ache. She looked relieved. She looked like she'd been waiting a long time. "Oh, sweetheart," she said. "I wasn't sure you were coming." I set the groceries down and hugged her and told her of course I was coming. What was she talking about? And she looked at me for a moment with something careful in her eyes, and then she said, "Your mother called this morning. She said they're not going to make it until Sunday." I stood very still. "Sunday," I repeated. "Something came up," my grandmother said, in the voice she used when she was being careful with my feelings. "She said you'd be here to help." I went into the kitchen so my grandmother wouldn't see my face while I processed that. I stood at the counter, and I looked at the text my mother had sent me at 6 that morning, which I hadn't read because I'd been rushing out the door. It said, "Slight change of plans. You'll be there with Grandma until we arrive Sunday afternoon. You're so good with her. We'll bring the cake. Love you." That was it. That was the whole message. I want to be clear about something. I love my grandmother. I have always loved her in a way that felt different from how I loved the rest of my family. Less complicated, less laced with the particular exhaustion of always being found slightly lacking. My grandmother never once made me feel like my job was not impressive enough, or my apartment too small, or my life moving too slowly. She asked about my students by name. She kept a photo of my 4th grade class on her refrigerator. When I got my teaching certification, she took me out to dinner, just the 2 of us. And she ordered champagne, and she said, "You're going to change lives, Claire. That's not nothing. That's everything." So being there with her was not the hardship. Being used as unpaid staff while my family enjoyed a mountain resort, that was the part that sat in my stomach like something cold. But I didn't call my mother. I didn't text back anything sharp or honest. I put my phone face down on the counter, and I went back into the living room and I said, "Well, it's you and me until Sunday. What do you want to do tonight?" My grandmother smiled and said, "There's a movie I've been meaning to watch. And I made soup this morning. The good kind, with the barley." We watched the movie. We ate the soup. She told me about her neighbor's new dog, and about a book she'd been reading, and about a rose bush she was thinking about planting in the spring. I told her about a student who had finally, after 4 months of struggling, read his first full chapter book out loud to the class, and she clapped her hands together like it was the best news she'd heard all week. I slept in the small room off the hallway that had been mine every summer when I was a child. The quilt on the bed was one she'd made herself, yellow and white squares, and it smelled like cedar and lavender and something I couldn't name that just smelled like her house. In the morning, she was already up when I came downstairs. standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, looking out at the backyard. She had a big yard for a woman living alone, nearly an acre, with a vegetable garden along the back fence and a patio with 2 iron chairs that had been there since before I was born. "How are you really doing?" I asked her. I don't know why I asked it that way. Something about the way she was standing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm all right. I have good days and slow days." Yesterday was a good day. What makes a slow day? She turned and looked at me. She had this way of looking at people direct and unhurried, like she had all the time in the world to see you clearly. "Mostly when the house gets too quiet," she said. "And when I start adding up how many people remembered to call." I didn't say anything. I got my coffee, and I stood next to her at the window, and we looked at the yard together. "Your father hasn't called in 3 weeks, she said, matter-of-factly. Not like she was complaining. More like she was reading from a ledger. "Melissa calls on birthdays. Daniel calls when he needs something." She paused. "You call on Tuesdays." I did call on Tuesdays. I hadn't realized she'd noticed. "I call because I want to," I said. "I know you do," she said. "That's the difference." We spent Saturday getting the house ready. I set up the tables on the patio and strung lights through the oak tree near the back fence. My grandmother directed from her chair with a cup of tea and a kind of quiet authority move, that centerpiece 2 inches to the left. "The good tablecloth is in the cedar chest, not the linen closet. We'll need more chairs from the garage." She was precise and particular, and I didn't mind it one bit. This was her house, her party, her 80th birthday, and I wanted it to be exactly what she wanted. Around 3 in the afternoon, while I was unfolding the last of the chairs, she said, "Can I tell you something?" "Always," I said. She set down her tea. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About what matters. About what I want the next part of my life to look like." She smoothed her hands over the arms of her chair. "When your grandfather died, everybody assumed I would just get smaller, sell the house, move somewhere easier, let people make decisions for me. Your mother started sending me brochures for assisted living when I was 72. I looked up. "I know," she said, a small smile. "I was 72. I was running 5 miles a week." She paused. "I know I'm slower now. I know I need help with some things. But I also know the difference between needing help and being managed." I put down the chair I was holding. "Grandma, I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. "I just want you to know that I see things clearly. I always have. I see how things are." She looked at me steadily. "And I see you." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just nodded and picked up the chair again, and she picked up her tea, and we let the afternoon settle around us. My family arrived Sunday at 1 o'clock, 40 minutes later than my mother had said, in 2 cars. Daniel had brought his girlfriend, Priya, who I had met once before at Thanksgiving, and who seemed as puzzled by my family as I privately was. Melissa came with her husband, and they brought their 2 kids, who immediately ran into the backyard and began dismantling everything I had arranged, with the careful attention of a person who has set up many things, only to watch children undo them in 30 seconds. My mother walked in and looked around the house and said, "Oh, this looks nice," in the tone she used when she meant it looked fine but not as nice as she would have done it. She gave me a brief hug, and then immediately began rearranging the flowers on the kitchen table. My father shook my hand. He has been shaking my hand since I was about 23. Before that, I think there were hugs. I can't fully remember when it changed. "How was Asheville?" I asked. "Beautiful," he said. "You should get down there sometime." Daniel found me in the kitchen, refilling the chip bowls, and said, without any particular guilt, "Hey, sorry we stuck you with the setup stuff. You know how it is, the reservation was non-refund destructible, and Mom figured you weren't doing anything, and would be fine with it." I looked at my brother. He was straightening his collar in the reflection of the microwave. "I had parent-teacher conferences," I said. "I rearranged my whole Friday." "Right," he said. "But you like doing this stuff. The domestics. You're good at it." He said it like it was a compliment. He genuinely believed it was a compliment. The party was nice. My grandmother sat at the center of it, in the way that 80-year-olds deserve to sit at the center of things, with everyone coming to her, bending down to hug her, telling her she looked wonderful, which she did. She wore a dress, the color of sage and pearl earrings, and she had her hair done, and she was gracious to every single person who came through that door. But I noticed things. The way my mother spoke to her with a kind of careful patience that was one shade away from condescension, like she was speaking to someone who might not quite understand. The way Daniel spent most of the party on the patio with his phone, stepping away to take calls. The way my father, when my grandmother told a long story about the early days of her bakery, glanced at his watch twice. My grandmother's bakery. I should explain that. My grandmother had run a bakery in this town for 31 years. Not a small one, she had started with one location when my mother was a teenager, and by the time she retired, she had 4 locations across 3 counties. She had built it herself, from a rented kitchen the size of a large closet, and she had run it herself, and she had sold it herself, in 2019, to a regional chain that had been trying to acquire it for years. She had received a fair price. I knew this because she had told me, one Tuesday on the phone, simply and without fanfare, the way she told me most important things. I had never heard my family discuss it. I had noticed, growing up, that they didn't really talk about it. I had noticed that when my grandmother said she was fine, financially, nobody ever asked what that meant. I had noticed that when she declined help from various relatives, they usually seemed more relieved than confused. On Sunday evening, after the guests had gone, and the kids had finally been corralled into the car, and the leftover cake had been wrapped in foil, my grandmother asked if I would stay one more night. She said it quietly, while we were washing dishes side by side. She said, "You don't have to. I know you have a drive." "I want to," I said. And I meant it. My mother, overhearing this from the doorway, said, "Oh, that's sweet," in a tone that suggested she found it slightly unnecessary, and then she hugged my grandmother for approximately 4 seconds and said they really needed to get on the road. That night, after everyone had left, my grandmother and I sat on the patio in the iron chairs under the lights I had strung through the oak tree, and she had a small glass of wine, and I had a larger one, and she said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." I put my wine down. "Okay," I said. She looked at the garden for a moment. The vegetable beds were winter bare, dark soil turned up neat and quiet. "When I sold the bakery," she said, "the price was significant. More than this family has ever given me credit for building. I made good investments after conservative ones, not exciting, but steady. I have been very deliberate for a long time about where things go when I'm gone." I was listening very carefully now. "I have a will," she said. "I updated it last year. I had a long conversation with my attorney, a woman I trust completely. I want you to know that my wishes are clearly documented and legally sound." She turned and looked at me. "I want you to know because I want someone in this family to understand why, before it happens, not after." "Grandma," I started. "I'm not sick," she said firmly. "I'm 80. Those are different things. I have good years left. But I am not naive about time." She folded her hands in her lap. "You have called me every Tuesday for 4 years. You drove 3.5 hours on a Friday because your mother told you to, and you came anyway, with groceries and a folding table, and you didn't say a single unkind word about any of them, even though you had every right to." She paused. "I pay attention, Claire. I always have." I felt something tighten in my chest. I don't want you to think I was doing any of that because I know why you did it," she said simply. "That's my point. I know exactly why. And there are other people in this family who would like me to believe they do things for the same reasons. And they don't. I know the difference." We were quiet for a while. "There's a property," she said finally. "This house and the land. There are also financial assets, the proceeds from the sale, what's grown since. It comes to a number that would surprise most people who think they know my situation." She looked at me steadily. "I have left the house and the majority of the estate to you. Your father, your mother, Daniel, and Melissa will each receive a sum it's fair, and it's generous. And I mean that genuinely. But the bulk goes to you." I opened my mouth. I closed it again. "You told me once," she said, "that you stay in teaching because you love it, even though everyone acts like you should want something else. You told me you love watching a child understand something they couldn't understand yesterday. You said it was the closest thing you knew to magic. She smiled, and it was the most herself I had ever seen her look. I want the person who believes in that kind of magic to be the one who decides what happens to this house. Because I believe she'll take care of it the way it deserves. I didn't say anything for a long time. The oak tree moved a little in the wind, and the lights swayed, and somewhere down the street, a dog was barking. I don't know what to say, I finally told her. You don't have to say anything, she said. I just wanted you to hear it from me, not from a lawyer in a conference room after I'm gone. I stayed Monday morning. We had breakfast together, and she walked me out to my car, and she stood on the porch until I pulled out of the driveway. I watched her in my rearview mirror until the oak trees closed behind me. I drove back to Columbus with the heat turned up and the radio off, and I thought about all of it, about the note my mother had sent me, about my brother straightening his collar in the microwave reflection, about my grandmother's face when she saw me through the window that Friday. Relieved, like she hadn't been sure I was coming. I did not tell my family what my grandmother had said to me on the patio. I went back to my classroom on Tuesday, and I taught long division, and I called my grandmother at the usual time, and she told me about a seed catalog she'd ordered, and about rain coming in on Thursday, and about a chapter in the book she was reading that had made her laugh out loud. I told her about a student who had drawn a portrait of me with what appeared to be 3 eyes, which she decided was a sign of great artistic vision. It was 14 months later that my grandmother's attorney called me on a Wednesday afternoon. My grandmother had passed quietly in her sleep in late January. Her neighbor had found her in the morning. She had not been sick, as she had told me she had simply been 80, and then it had been time. I drove up on a Thursday. I sat in the attorney's office on a Friday with my parents and Daniel and Melissa, and we listened as the will was read. My parents and Daniel and Melissa each received $250,000, a sum that was, as my grandmother had promised, fair and generous enough to matter, carefully chosen. The house, the land, and the remainder of the estate, which had grown over the years to just over $3 million from the bakery sale and nearly 2 decades of patient investment, went to me. The silence in that conference room was a particular kind of silence, the kind that has weight and texture to it. My mother was the first to speak. She said, "This doesn't make sense." The attorney was a calm woman with short silver hair and 20 years of experience in exactly this kind of room. She said, "I can walk you through the document in detail if that would be helpful." My father said. She was clearly not in her right mind. The attorney said that my grandmother had been assessed by 2 independent physicians within the past 18 months, both of whom had documented her to be fully cognitively sound, and that documentation was attached to the filing. She said it in the same calm tone. She had clearly anticipated this conversation. Daniel didn't say anything. He was looking at the document in front of him with an expression I had never seen on his face before, the expression of a person who has just discovered something they thought they understood and did not. Melissa looked at me. I don't know what she was looking for. I didn't look away. Outside the conference room, in the parking lot, my mother cried. Not the soft, private kind, the kind that was looking for a place to go. She said I had manipulated my grandmother. She said I had made myself seem more devoted than I was. She said this was not what Grandma would have wanted. I listened to all of it. I had thought about this moment a lot in the 14 months since that patio conversation, and I had decided, very deliberately, what kind of person I wanted to be inside it. "Mom," I said, when she had finished. I called her every Tuesday for 4 years. I drove up when you asked me to come because you needed someone to watch her. I stayed when she asked me to stay. I didn't do any of it for this. But I'm also not going to apologize for it. She stared at me. "If you want to contest it," I said, "you have every right to. But the documentation is thorough, and you knew Grandma. You know she was the most clear-eyed person in any room she was ever in, including this one." My mother did not respond to that. She got in the car with my father, and they drove away. I stood in the parking lot for a few minutes by myself. The air was cold and the sky was the particular white it gets in Ohio in late January, flat and even, like the world had been ironed. I thought about my grandmother standing at the kitchen window in her good cardigan, looking at the driveway, waiting. I thought about the way she had said, "I see you. the way she'd meant it. There were hard months after that. My family's relationship with me did not heal quickly or cleanly. There were emails I didn't answer, and phone calls I let go to voicemail, and a period of several weeks where I simply gave myself permission to be quiet about all of it. My student with the three-eyed portrait moved on to 5th grade and sent me a note on the last day of school that said I was his favorite teacher he had ever had and that he was going to be an artist. I put it on my refrigerator. I moved into my grandmother's house in the spring. I kept the oak trees. I planted the vegetable garden the way she had shown me, along the back fence, turning the soil the way she had. The barley soup recipe folded and tucked inside the kitchen drawer where she had kept it. I kept calling on Tuesdays, for a while, before I realized there was no one on the other end. I would dial the number and it would ring, and then I would hang up, and then eventually I stopped. But for a long time, Tuesday at 7:30 in the evening, I would make a cup of tea and sit at the kitchen table and just be quiet for a few minutes, the way I would have been if she'd answered. I think about what she said to me sometimes, when I'm in the classroom on a slow afternoon, watching a child work through something that doesn't make sense yet and is about to. You love watching a child understand something they couldn't understand yesterday. You said it was the closest thing you knew to magic. She was right. It still is. I'm not going to tell you that everything worked out perfectly after that, because that's not quite how it goes. Daniel reached out to me 8 months later, by email, and said he was sorry for how he'd handled things in that conference room. It was a short email, honest in a way I hadn't expected from him, and I wrote back and said thank you. We are not close, but we are something. My sister and I have had 2 dinners in the past year that were quiet and careful, and almost like talking to someone I am just getting to know for the first time. It is a strange feeling, getting to know your sibling at 29, but I think it might be worth something. My parents, that is a longer, slower thing. We speak at holidays. I do not expect it to be more than it is, and that expectation, finally releasing it, has been one of the quieter and more useful things I have done for myself. I teach 4th grade. I live in the house with the oak trees. Every spring I plant along the back fence. My grandmother left me more than the house. She left me the thing she'd been trying to show me for years, that showing up, the real kind, costs something. That it is quiet and unspectacular, and nobody is usually watching when you do it. That the person paying the most attention is almost always the person you think doesn't notice. She noticed. She always had, and at the end, so did I.